Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to my November wrap-up. I read 8 things in November, including one of my favourite books of all time. So let's get into my list. First of all, I read Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. This came out in November, but I was lucky enough to get an earlier copy. So I did read the novella that comes before this, but I read it after I finished Rhythm of War. So I kind of read stuff out of order. But as for Rhythm of War, I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. I filmed an entire spoilery vlog where I gave all of my reactions to everything. I also filmed a separate review, so I'm not really going to go into what this is about because obviously, because it's book 4, it will contain spoilers if I talk about a synopsis. Loosely, what this is about is in The Way of Kings, which is the first book, there is an oncoming desolation, which is like an apocalypse in this world. And the heralds, who are usually the ones who come back from a desolation to stop this oncoming apocalypse, they have walked away from their responsibilities. So now it's only up to the characters that we get introduced to kind of stop this. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, but that's the most loose description I can give you if you are interested in picking up this series. I think the length scares a lot of people away, but it's a series that is written in a way that is quite palpable, especially to newer readers. And so even if it looks so large, I would encourage people to give it a go because Brandon Sanderson's writing is quite easy to get into. But I digress. I loved this. I loved the world building in here. I love how the world building became more technological in this book, and I love how there was a specific focus on mental health as well, because that's been talked about in the previous books, but it really became we're going to acknowledge it in this book, and I really appreciated that and the character development that went along with it. I loved so much about this book. That is why it made my favourite books of 2020 list, and it is why it is one of my new favourites of all time. I definitely plan on rereading this. I think someone has just started mowing their lawn. Amazing. Next up, I read 2 volumes of a graphic novel, and this is quite a popular graphic novel, but for some reason I just kind of put it off because I didn't think that I would like it, but silly me, I gave these really high ratings and I'm really enjoying this series, and it is Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This is volume 3, and I also read volume 2 as well. I think I gave volume 2 a 5 out of 5 stars, and I gave volume 3 a 4.5 out of 5 stars. This follows Charlie, who is a boy at high school. He's gay, and he was outed a while ago by one of his classmates. He doesn't know who, but as a result, he went through a ton of bullying and hazing from all of the kids at the school. And now he's just started to kind of not get over that, but get past it. And people aren't quite accepting necessarily of him. There are bullies in here, but there's also a really lovely safe space in here that is with Charlie's friends, and there's a support network in place for him. So while there are bleak aspects to this story, there's a really significant support network and a really wholesome tone that goes along with it. This is a romance between Charlie and Nick, and I love how their relationship was explored in these 2 books. I especially love the second one because it made me tear up and it also made me laugh at different points. And if it's going to elicit that kind of reaction, it means that I'm very invested in the characters. The art style in here is not like Saga by Brian K. Vaughan, for example. It's not brilliantly coloured, it's not super detailed, but when I went into it, the line art actually quite surprised me, and I think I'm a bit of an art snob because I expect the quality of Saga, but when I went into this, it used to be a webcomic and now it's being printed as a physical book, and I love just the line art in here. It's very expressive and it's very emotive, it's very unique, and I really enjoyed it. So I think I put it off because of the art style, and I shouldn't have, because I love the art style and I love the story. So if anyone is putting off Heartstopper, don't, because it's lovely, it's cute, it's wholesome, it's funny, it's got brilliant characters, and you delve into everybody. You don't just get the main characters. There is significant growth given to the side characters as well, which makes the story seem a lot more broad, which I really like. You'll notice that I read 2 contemporary graphic novels after finishing Rhythm of War, so from a giant chunky fantasy into contemporary, I think my brain needed a little bit of a break. And then I read something that's been on my to-be-read pile for a very long time, and that is The Passage by Justin Cronin. I have had this for like 3 years, and I finally finished it. I listened to it on audiobook, and I wanted to give it a 5 stars initially because I'd heard it was an apocalyptic book, but then when I started it, it was very different. So it has a time skip in here, and you skip 100 years into the future. So it's like a vampire apocalypse situation, but you hear from characters at the beginning and then you skip forward 100 years and you see the development and ramifications of what was happening to those characters at that time. So because it didn't start like an apocalypse and it felt like two very different books to me, I gave the first half like 3.5 stars. And then I liked how the ending developed from the middle to the ending, I mean. So I gave the book overall a 4 because it went up. So it's a bit of a complicated one to rate, but I think I liked it because I do want to continue on with the series, and I do like the characters in here. So we start out with Amy, and she's a little girl who gets experimented on, and then later down the track we follow a group of survivors in this, I guess, like this city with walls and lights to keep the monsters out, but the lights might potentially not work forever because they've been working this long kind of on a miracle. It's been 100 years. And we follow Peter, and I think it's Peter and a group of his friends. So it's not young adult, it's very new adult in the sense that these characters are a little bit older, and it's their survival story. And I like what they ran into. I like their trials and tribulations. Some things were a little bit long-winded to me, but other things I really enjoyed. And I can't talk about what those things are without spoiling anything, but I like how the world building was developed as well. So I think that's all I'm going to leave this at. If you haven't read this yet, maybe try the audiobook, because that helped me definitely get through this, because I think if I was reading it physically, I wouldn't have continued reading, because the first third to the first half was not something that I enjoyed as much, even though the characters were interesting. So I liked this. I gave it a 4. Next, I read something. I actually buddy read this with Steph, and she was very patient with me because I took a long time, but it is Contest by Matthew Riley. This is like an adult version of The Hunger Games, but with aliens. So it's about this guy who gets abducted, I guess, into the contest, and he gets accidentally abducted with his daughter, so he has to protect his young child while defending against aliens trying to kill him. And I liked the concept of the book, but I didn't like the execution. So I'm a very character reader, and this was a very plot book. So it felt like a very self-insert book. And I think if it was an action movie, I could get behind the spectacle and I could enjoy the viewing experience. But because it was a written work, I struggled to connect with the character because we didn't get a lot from him. We got motivations and we got emotions sometimes, but there was a part where he alluded to something tragic in his past, and it was just kind of summed up in a paragraph, and that was it really. And I expected more of an emotional reaction to having that memory kind of bombard him. So there were little moments like that throughout this book that I was like, but I did like the general concept. I wish it was just executed a little bit better. I think this was Matthew Riley's first book, or one of his first, so he was still kind of finding himself as a writer. So I guess my apprehension kind of makes a little bit of sense if I look at it that way. But I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't bad by any means. It was just enjoyable, and it wasn't like a new favorite or anything. So I'm glad that I finally read this, because it's been on my to be read pile for like 7 years. So that is a big tick. I'm glad I finished it. Next up, I read a young adult fantasy, and that is A River of Royal Blood by Amanda Joy. And this follows our main character, Eva, who has to be in a contest with her sister to fight to the death and then gain royalty. But the way that this premise was executed in the book, that part didn't really play into it until closer to the end, and the rest of it is build up to that point. And I liked in the build up how we got a lot of world building, and we got a lot of a sense of the environment and the motivations of our main character and the characters around her. When I read a young adult fantasy work, I don't necessarily expect the breadth of world building that we got in this book, and that is one of the reasons that I quite enjoyed it. However, I think I struggled to connect with the book, and I think that's just from my age potentially, but there was a lot going on, so I'm not sure why I didn't like it. I did like it. I'm not sure why I didn't love it. I think it's just something that I've outgrown the taste of because I got this a while ago. So it was quite enjoyable, and that's why I'm talking about it, because I think a lot of people will really like it. But when I was reading it, I don't know if I'd seen all of the stuff in here trope-wise that happened before, but I think again it struggled with the same thing that Matthew Riley's book had. It was a lot of plot driving the character forward, so it felt a little bit inevitable in certain aspects rather than a character making rash decisions or pushing things forward in a character-driven way. So the plot wasn't reacting to the character was reacting to the plot. That is the best way I can describe it, and I'm not necessarily sure if that makes sense, but that's how I read it. So I'm hoping that other people read it and get a lot more from it than what I did, because it's a really enjoyable book, but I think I'd just outgrown it. And that's why I was a bit hesitant to read it, because it's been on my to be read pile for a while and my reading tastes have changed. So this was a 3.5 stars. It was enjoyable, but it wasn't a new favorite either. And then next up, I listened to an audiobook, and that is World War Z. And I've had this again on my to be read pile for a very long time. I've gone to unhaul it a couple of times, and my partner's always gone, don't do that, read it because you'll like it. And I'm glad he persisted, because he was right. I've DNF'd this once, and that was reading it physically. And then I got the audiobook off Audible, and I'm really glad that I did. This is a zombie apocalypse book, as the title kind of indicates. It was made into a movie, but the book and the movie are very different. So the movie is very much more in the zombie apocalypse and very action focused. This is after the zombie apocalypse. So you know that the humans have won, but you don't know how. So we go back in time and we interview all these characters that had key responsibilities and key roles in seeing different aspects of the apocalypse. And I loved seeing that breadth to it, because it gave it a well-rounded aspect. And when I look at this and I look at the COVID pandemic, a lot of similarities exist with the beginnings of the outbreaks. And it's kind of scary how Max Brooks managed to predict the way that people would respond and the way that different countries even would respond. So I like that it felt real, and I liked a bunch of the stories in here. Sometimes they got a little bit long-winded, and I was like, okay, I'm ready for the next one now. But I liked the majority of the stories in here. So I had to give this a 4. And each narrator also has a different voice actor. So when he's interviewing people, it felt authentic because the voices were constantly being changed. So I like that part about it as well. I think it was just done very well. I think it's one of the more interesting zombie apocalypse books that I've read, just because of the perspective was shifted, and it's told more like in a journal format, which I enjoyed as well, a journal/interview. So this guy is going back to interview everybody. So I really liked it. 4 stars. And then the last book on this reading wrap up is Dawn Shard by Brandon Sanderson. I finished this yesterday, so it's still very fresh in my head, and I gave it a 4.5 stars. I initially was going to give it a 4, but then closer to the end I got emotional, and I don't know how Brandon manages to do that every time, but because it elicited such an emotional response in me, I bumped up some of the rating. Not a new favorite like Rhythm of War, but still really, really good. And I don't know how to describe too much detail about it without spoiling it, because this is a book that comes after Oathbringer but before Rhythm of War, and so we follow a character in here who goes on a sea voyage quest, and I can't give you more than that because it'll spoil things. So I like the world building that was done in here. Brandon is just making leaps and bounds in his Stormlight Archive world building, which I adore. So I really appreciated that in here, and I loved the characterization. I can't say who, but we follow a couple of side characters, and I like how he brings a new dimension to each side character whenever we get to see them and see their perspective and see them developed. It's so good. I love all the characters in this universe. So I really enjoyed Dawn Shard. I wish I'd read it before Rhythm of War, but because I got Rhythm of War early, it didn't really work out that way. So what a shame. I'm just going to have to go back and read Rhythm of War. So there you have it. These are all of the books that I read in November. Oh, I knew that would happen. Thank you so much for watching this video. Chat to me down below in the comments, and I'll catch you in my next one. Bye.